Hello. This is Curiosity, written by W.J. May, narrated by Zach Smith. Chapter 1. It is a strange thing to look upon a place that has seen so much death. After who knew how many moons had streaked above them, and how many miles had rolled beneath the companions' weary feet, the earth was still, and the air was suddenly quiet. Too quiet. It was not the natural order of things. They stood in the midst of all that stillness, becoming part of it themselves. Perhaps it was not the death itself, but that not a single echo of that which had been living remained. It was like taking a stroll along the gentle curves of an ancient battlefield, overgrown with grass and meadow flowers sprung from the bodies of the men who resided below. Where were the screams, the ghosts, the justice? How could such a place have gone on living? How could it dare to be quiet or beautiful? What nerve of those flowers, nourished with the tears of widows and orphans? There was nothing beautiful about that particular vista. There was nothing regrown from anything that had come before. Like a ghastly mirror, all history and memory had been erased, removed from the earth in the breath of a dragon, tragically smoothed in an endless sea of glass. 3 people stood upon that glass, 3 people stretched in reflection beneath them. Not one could manage to speak. What comes next? It was the question each of them had been thinking, framing each shuddering glance and hovering on the tips of their tongues. 2 of them were merely uncertain, but the third had retreated inside himself, searching the span of his eternal memory for a hint if he'd ever seen the like. When that silence became too heavy, the shifter forced himself to speak. "What happens now?" Kiera's gaze lifted, then travelled to the Fae. He had not reacted in any way to the question, but was continuing to stare blankly into that endless expanse. "Eden, what happens now?" Jesse shifted impatiently, feeling those ghosts whether they were there or not. "You have seen what the creature has done. What are the next steps?" The Fae opened his mouth to answer, then closed it once again. It was difficult to blame him. While they might have been an immortal people, there were still things that roamed the land older than the Fae. There were still things they had not yet seen. In the faint glow emanating off the glass, he suddenly looked scarcely older than they were themselves, a young man just reaching his early 20s, or perhaps just leaving his teens. Kiera stared a moment, then took a step closer. "You did not believe me," she said softly. He looked at her then, the first thing to have caught his eyes since the glass. There was a fleeting moment where the 2 merely stared at each other. Then he turned back to the sky. "I believe you now." Whatever might have been buried beneath the words, these seemed to shift things. He stared only a moment longer before pulling in a sudden breath, having made up his mind. "I'll do this myself." Jesse stopped pacing, and Kiera stared in shock as Eden took an absent-minded step away from them, trying to settle the chaos of conflicting ideas racing through his mind. "I don't know what this is," he continued almost to himself, "or what else might lie ahead. I have only questions, and none of the answers. I'm not sure how it is you 2 found each other, but it must have been in a place not far from here. You should leave together the same way." They paused mid-step behind him and continued to stare. Only a few seconds had passed, but he was already planning out the next steps, already assessing what little remained of their supplies, what hadn't been demolished in their skirmish with the wolves. His head tilted ever so slightly as his eyes drifted towards the horizon, almost like he was reading the surface of a map. Then, all at once, he registered the 2 shadows behind him. "Is it my use of the common tongue?" he asked in surprise, glancing back. "Have I misremembered a word?" They shared a quick glance, then stepped forward at the same time. "For what possible reason do you think I'll let you do this alone?" Kiera asked quietly, for once having no trouble meeting the Fae's eyes. "When it was my village that was destroyed, when it was my life that was almost lost trying to bring the message this far." Her eyes flashed, but she maintained a steady calm. "You have no idea what this creature might be. Neither do I. For once, we are on equal footing. For what possible reason do you think a few words from you could keep me away?" Eden's lips parted to answer, but Jessie beat him to it. "I don't see why the plan is any different than before." He kept his gaze between them, no longer looking at the remains of the village straight on. "We should return to Farian and tell the rest of your people what you've seen. Was that not always the plan? Was it not always what we agreed?" Silence rang out between them as the Fae eyed their aggressive posture with a frown. He didn't like how close they'd gotten, and he didn't like the idea that they might not be persuaded to turn away. He began to say as much, then ended up saying something different instead. "We cannot return to Farian," he murmured. "My people have heard talk of this kind of thing before, just whispers, but—" He trailed off into silence, shaking his head. "But they'll believe you," Jessie pressed. "If you tell them what's happened."
"Yes, they would believe me," Eden interrupted him quietly. "But they would not know what to do. Such a beast is foreign to my people, same as yours."
"Yes, but what would you have them do? Would you have them mount their horses, ride off towards the nearest glass village? For what? The creature has already left. Things do not usually rest where they choose to hunt. And what if they were to find it? How does one defeat such a monster?" His eyes swept over the endless sheet of glass, no doubt imagining more townships and villages in its stead, and more people too, in places Kiera had not yet dreamed. She watched him carefully, then crossed what remained of the space between them. "You said you have only questions and none of the answers," she said softly, keeping that bright gaze locked upon his face. "That is the first problem, not the dragon. So what will you do?" He was quiet for a moment, staring down at her with a touch of surprise. Then it came upon him, slowly at first, but with a bright spark of purpose, like the rising of a new dawn. "I'll find someone who does." As long as it had taken to reach the remains of Cattaling, the three companions were just as quick to leave, keeping their eyes deliberately forward as they vanished once again into the thick shroud of trees, trying to blink away the throbbing glow of the glass. In the cool damp of the forest, away from the surreal nightmare they had left behind, it was easier to breathe freely and think clearly. It was easier to temper the image, to soften the edges and try to convince themselves the worst had come from the secret depths of their own minds. They knew it to be false, but for today it was the sweetest of lies. "While I appreciate a cryptic revelation as much as the next guy, I still don't understand where we're going," Jessie finally said, following in the steps of the Fae, with eyes locked on his shimmering braids of hair. "I also haven't a clue who you're hoping to speak with." Eden nodded faintly, as if there was likely a great deal the shifter didn't understand. He then leapt suddenly over the side of the trail they'd been walking and landed in a cool grove of cedar. The others followed with a trace of anxiety, watching in silence. "You were not wrong," Eden murmured quietly, eyes sweeping the trees. "The things you said about my people, we are guardians of such places as these, but we seldom work alone." At once he fixed on a particular point, stilling with anticipation. He stared for a split second, then flashed a look over his shoulder, eyes dancing with a hidden smile. "You'll love this next part." Before Kiera could wonder what he meant, a sudden breeze swept through the grove, stirring up the leaves. The smell of the wood was overwhelming, soaking deep inside her lungs and making her exhale with the sheer pleasure of it. It made her think of lighter things, drier things she hadn't felt since childhood, things her parents might have built before they died. Then, all at once, they were not alone.
"Oh my!"
She gasped aloud and leaned into Jessie, staring with astonishment at the woman standing beside the trees. It was a woman in name only, but Kiera had never seen anyone so lovely. She was fair enough in countenance to rival even the eternal maidens she'd seen in Farian, but there was something a bit wilder to her as well. It took a moment to place before she realized the woman reminded her very much of the trees where they were standing, bright and clipped and dry, with hair like the rustling of branches and almond-shaped eyes the color of fresh wheat.
This must be a nymph.
Eden sank immediately to his knees, staring up at her from the height of a child. She lowered her gaze only for a moment, cheeks still flushed in surprise, then knelt down as well. Their hands touched lightly together before falling to their sides.
"Sweet lady," he began softly, "thank you for speaking with me." "It is an honor, my lord."
Her head bowed in deference, though her eyes rested upon him with a twinkling smile.
"I dwell now in the land of mortals. Too long has it been since one of the fair folk has come to call."
He smiled in return, then leaned closer.
"I am searching for a discrepancy, a tangle in the web."
She tilted her head, eyes glassing over.
"Something that was not there before."
He nodded, watching her.
"Something that may appear as a mere illusion."
An illusion? Kiera shared a quick look with Jessie as the two immortals knelt together in the middle of the grass. It was quiet for a moment. Then, with a tiny pop, the nymph vanished back into the trees. Eden leaned back with a start. "Was that good?" Jessie asked hesitantly.
"I'm not entirely sure."
The three of them stood in silence, glancing repeatedly around the forest, wondering if the lovely woman was going to return. Then, all at once, she was kneeling beside the Fae once more.
"There is talk of such a thing, but nowhere near this place. It is far north of where we are now."
Her eyes danced with sunbeams, and she spoke in a lilting cadence, almost on the verge of a song.
"Over mountains thick with forests, and forests thick with trees."
Kiera slowly raised her eyebrows. There was something quite enchanting about it, but something unhinged as well. She'd heard many such couplets in her time spent tending a bar. Eden pushed to his feet with a smile.
"Then I shall journey onward and speak with you in time."
She accepted his hands, rising to her feet as well.
"Not I, my lord, but one of my sisters."
Her fingers laced through his own, and she floated a step closer, eyes sweeping the length of him.
"Blessings on your journey."
Without a hint of warning, she stretched onto her toes and kissed him on the mouth, hands wrapping behind his head, tongues tangling together, hair whispering around them in the breeze. It went on a lot longer than the rest of them were comfortable with, a lot longer than perhaps was normal. Then, just as quickly as it started, she vanished with another pop into the trees. Eden took a moment to catch his breath, then turned back to the others.
"Shall we?"
Strange as the encounter was, there was some comfort in it for the others. They had a plan now. They had a course to be charted. But there were other considerations to be attended.
"We will need to stock up for a longer journey,"
Eden remarked, stepping through a break in the forest and gazing towards the distant mountains.
"If you two are truly intent upon coming with me, the road will be much more dangerous than what has come before, and there is no telling how many weeks or even months such a thing might take. We may be traveling together for a long while."
Even as he said the words, they seemed to strike home, not just with the Fae, but with each of his mortal companions. They shared a brief look, flushing at the thought, then turned away. It was one thing to have committed to a small journey, a trip that could be completed in less than a fortnight. It was quite another to embark upon a quest that could span the length and breadth of the realm. For while they might have shared food and companionship around the fire, while they may have banded together to protect themselves from the wolves, they did not know each other. "I will commit myself to such a thing," Jesse said softly, flashing a look at Kiera. His gaze lingered before travelling back to the Fae. "We have committed ourselves already." Eden let out a quiet sigh, then turned to face them. "I wish that was not the case," he said softly, eyes drifting between them. "I say it not to offend, only to keep you from some distant harm. We know not where this journey may take us, and there is much in these woods that could finish us just as easily as a dragon." The others might have been offended anyway, but there was something so achingly sincere in the way he said it that even Jesse found himself softening in response. This was a man who had seen too many of those dangers as the centuries drifted past. This was a man who had buried too many young companions, the same satchels on their shoulders, the same light of adventure in their eyes. "I would remind you of something very important." Kiera slowly walked towards him, taking the smallest blade from the crook of his belt. It was the one he'd given her only a few days before. She'd washed and returned it. "I would remind you how essential I was fighting the wolves." The Fae's eyes sparkled with laughter, though his face remained stern. When Jesse came up beside her, clearly set in his decision, Eden merely acquiesced with another quiet sigh. "I suppose I cannot stop you," he murmured, raking back his hair with a restless twitch of his hands. "If I tied you to a tree, those beasts would come for you all the same. You'd probably be killed by a nest of squirrels, or perhaps a swarm of unruly bees." There was a beat of silence. "Perhaps we could leave him behind," Jesse suggested, turning to Kiera with hope. "Very much tied to a tree. There must be a hive around here somewhere." "So it is decided," she interrupted, circling them back on point. "The three of us will set out together, find this discrepancy you're looking for, and gain the answers we seek." Eden's eyes twinkled again as he tilted his head, appraising her, appraising the blade. "You'll likely get quite good with that by the end. We'll have to start being nicer to you." Jesse shook his head fiercely, shooting the Fae a chiding glance. "Do not give her false hope, and do not lower our own expectations." With that, he turned to Kiera. "You must stop talking so much. It is unbearable to travel in such a way." She flounced past him, first on the trail. The tiny knife glinted in the sunlight, and she danced it in the air in front of her, lips remembering the Fae's instructions, lips curving with a little smile. Little flicks. Chapter 2. The first day was not a good one. Quite possibly because it brought with it the promise of so many countless more. The uncertainty of the expanse before them did nothing to build upon those fledgling foundations, but seemed to drive them just the opposite, undoing whatever tentative conversations had started to bind them together, making them almost shy in each other's presence. There were no wasted words, no bursts of laughter, no mindless prattling or exasperated smiles at the conclusion of some joke or whimsical tale. Answers were clipped, discussions were fleeting, and stretches of wide, gaping silence filled the moments in between. By the end of the first day, Kiera had almost forgotten the trio of companions that had set out from Farian, the ones who had mocked each other, then saved each other in the woods. She couldn't imagine how awkward the night would be, just the three of them, lying out under the stars. "Then do something about it. You're the one who brought them. Do something to break the ice." "So, I was thinking that tonight I might take first watch." It was the first time any of them had spoken in a while. They had been more preoccupied with pushing their way up an uneven slope littered with brambles and thick clusters of holly. The words took a second to register, then both men flashed each other a quick glance. "You?" Eden repeated as he walked, having no further strategy. "Such a thing has never happened before." Jessie nodded along, as if nothing more than conversational.
I'd think you'd want the rest.
No, I want to contribute, she interrupted lightly, skipping to the front. I can also take the lead sometimes as we hike. It doesn't always have to be one of you. Again, the men glanced at each other. Again, neither could think of what to say.
I don't mind, the Fae played it off casually. It can be dangerous.
Exactly, it can be dangerous, she repeated seriously, glancing over her shoulder at his incredulous face. I'd hate to let you take that risk alone. We must share it. She nodded soundly, approving the idea even as she spoke. Share the travel, share the risk. A bright smile flashed between them. That's got a nice ring, doesn't it? Jessie was staring at her bracingly. The Fae was simply at a loss.
There are reasons. Eden caught himself and started again. There are reasons why it makes sense for you to stay near the back of the... Jessie, tell her.
The shifter flashed him a look of betrayal. Why me? Eden shrugged with perfect innocence.
Weren't you just telling me how you were concerned for Kiera's safety? How we must take whatever precautions we can to keep her safe?
He gestured vaguely between them, without meeting anyone's eyes.
Come now, don't be shy.
With a look that promised a continuation of the discussion later that night, Jessie turned his eyes reluctantly to Kiera. For once, she wasn't staring back, but was skipping out in front, her fiery hair dancing behind her, looking like the world's most delicious snack for anything on their trail. He took a silent breath, choosing his words with care.
Perhaps when you've had a bit more...
What I mean is that we should probably... He lit up with a sudden possibility. Perhaps I could walk with you. We could take the lead together. I will also be hunting for the remainder of the journey. There was a beat of silence. Then both men stopped in their tracks. Jessie was shaking his head, looking ready to wrap his hands around her neck, while Eden was regarding her with the hint of a smile. She turned around to face them, taking advantage of the moment to catch her breath, before gesturing to the endless path that lay ahead. Can we talk, please? She asked sweetly, before I kill myself. The silence lingered a second more, before shattering in a soft chorus of laughter. So you want to hunt? Jessie quipped, cutting through a thicket of brambles with a slice of his blade. You'll probably want to take the lead with the dragon as well. You can approach it first.
There's no reason she can't take part in the hunting, Eden countered. We could string her from the trees, let her dangle there as bait. We'd be sure to catch much larger predators.
This has taken a dark turn. Coming from you, Jessie replied with a grin. The man who decided to arm her. The man who decided to train her in battle against all the dangers that may come. Eden glanced speculatively at the trees, gauging their height. We could still give her a knife. It might be irresponsible not to. His eyes drifted to Kiera before growing stern.
But you'd have to promise not to cut yourself down.
She nodded vaguely, taking the blade from her belt. I'll find something else to cut instead. Instead of just saying the words, she paired them with a little thrust, reversing her stride abruptly and pressing the tip against the Fae's chest. Eden froze in complete surprise, staring not at the knife, but at the girl, as if she might not have realized what just happened. When he saw it was intentional, he threw back his head with a burst of sparkling laughter, the kind of laughter that was contagious, the kind of laughter that soon vanished the knife and had Jessie laughing as well. He was quick to laugh, she suddenly realized. He was anything but cold. Do you remember when we were traveling to Cattaling? She began casually, sheathing the blade once again, and you invited me to ask any questions of you that I wished. His smile faded slightly, and he threw her a look. I never said anything of the... Back in Farian, she interrupted cheerfully. The rest of the Fae didn't seem too concerned with the prospect of a roe dragon tearing around their countryside. If I hadn't stepped straight into your friend's path, I don't know if he would have even stopped to speak with me. She remembered the flat expression on the immortal's face, the way he'd foisted them onto Eden like some kind of punishment. It wasn't exactly a question, but she was asking all the same.
My people are concerned with civilization now,
Eden answered with a wry smile.
You need only to ask them. They love to speak of it.
That seemed true enough. She'd never seen such an abrupt transformation. The way the owner of the tavern had lit up the moment they mentioned the prospect of a city. Tarviel, she remembered. That's what he called it.
But not you?
Jessie asked curiously. The Fae shook his head, striding gracefully up the path.
I'm not a builder. There is still much to explore.
She trailed after him, stepping in the faint outline of his footsteps. It wasn't in her nature to pry, at least not out loud, but the man was trapped with literally nowhere to escape the conversation, while she and Jessie had already fished out every detail about each other. It was the Fae's turn. But if they do build such a city, will you live there? The Fae raked back his hair with a sigh, quickening the pace.
The dog is right. You talk too much.
The dog gave him a hard shove. Will you live there? She repeated inquisitively. And where were you living before? When I asked you said that it wasn't Farian, but a place very far away. At least this question the Fae seemed willing to answer.
I am from a place called Savine, he said quietly, throwing a smile over his shoulder. An evergreen forest on the crest of the sea. I grew up scampering through those trees, over the giant rocks that covered the shoreline. There was something quite enchanting about it.
He opened his mouth as if to say something further, then closed it again. Savine, she repeated softly. It sounds beautiful. The Fae nodded faintly, pulling back a branch to allow the others through.
It was beautiful. It was also cold.
He smiled to himself, picturing those pristine shores.
A cold beach is the best sort. The mist in your face, the stones beneath your shoes.
She smiled in spite of herself. It was impossible not to. How long since you've been there? A shadow passed across his face, like he'd stepped out of the sun.
A very long time. Too long.
Perhaps he sensed she was only beginning her assault. Perhaps he was simply desperate enough for a change of subject. But he found himself turning to the shifter.
What about you?
Jessie glanced over curiously. What about me?
It's such a riveting discussion. Surely you have something to add.
There was a pause. Are we going to talk about how you almost impregnated that tree nymph?
By the time the companions had set up camp that night, the sun had long since vanished beneath the horizon, and Kiera was buckling at the knees. She kept steady until the very end, casting a covert glance at the others before dropping to the ground beside the fire. The flames crackled merrily and shot up occasional bursts of sparks as she inched closer, warming her pale hands. How are they able to do this? She watched in silence as the others moved briskly about the camp, filling canteens and shaking out blankets. How are they not dead on their feet? She might have been accustomed to hard work, but, as she was quickly coming to realize, that didn't translate into hard travel. Unlike her new friends, who swept easily across the unforgiving terrain, she found herself scrambling to keep pace. Her feet were throbbing, her skin was blistered, and even though she was sitting beside the fire, it still felt as though she couldn't catch her breath. All right, dear. How about it?
Eden settled beside her in a graceful moment, eyes twinkling with mischief in the light of the fire.
You ready to do a little hunting? Maybe check the perimeter.
She laughed in spite of herself, curling her knees to her chest. I should have actually stabbed you. He tilted back his head with a smile, remembering her threatening blade.
That's right, you tried to stab me.
Didn't try hard enough, Jessie quipped, but he flashed the Fae a grin as he settled beside them, stretching his long legs towards the fire. So where are we going? What is this discrepancy? Kiera turned with sudden curiosity, having wondered the same thing all day herself.
Who is this discrepancy?
Eden corrected with a smile. leaning back and resting his head against the smooth bark of a tree. Many thousands of years my people have walked this earth, but there are still creatures who came before. The man we're seeking is one of these. Kiera blinked in surprise. It was not the answer she'd been expecting. Is he Fae? Eden shook his head. I couldn't tell you exactly what he is, only that he speaks and moves like a man. I've never met him myself. I've only heard of him through another. But from what I understand, he and those like him live in the hollows of this world, carving out space where they cannot be disturbed. Kiera and Jessie shared a look. Then the shifter leaned forward. You are terrible at explaining things. Has anyone ever told you that? The Fae glanced up in surprise, then chuckled under his breath. No one has ever told me that. Jessie rolled his eyes with a grin, muttering something about immortality being wasted on immortals, while Kiera scooted even closer, staring up at the Fae with wide eyes. What are the hollows of this world? She asked curiously. I've never heard the phrase. He regarded her with an affectionate smile. The hollows have less to do with location and more to do with the magic that keeps them secret, he explained. It would be like the current of a river parting around some unseen stone. You could walk right past them and never know they were there. Jessie stared at him with a hint of alarm. So they're sorcerers, magicians of some kind. Not all magic belongs to those who conjure it, Eden said a bit sharply, tossing another log onto the fire. There are elemental forces older and more powerful than your fledgling sorcerers could ever hope to achieve. The ancient ones have access to this, along with a few others. Like you. Magic, he repeated under his breath, is a vulgar word. I used it only to help you understand. Believe me when I tell you the death of this world will come on the heels of magic. Having been raised in such a remote village, Kiera had never seen such things for herself. But there had always been whispers, hushed rumors shared around a quiet fire about those who had begun to harness such power for themselves. Groups of young men, raw and inexperimental, disrupting the ancient order of things and dabbling in hexes and spells beyond their control. After hearing Eden speak of things like balance and harmony, it was easy to imagine how the Fae might despise them. Given the look on Eden's face, she decided not to ask. And the nymphs? She began instead. They will be able to find one of these places? Eden shook his head, staring with a pensive expression at the fire. Not directly, but they will be able to sense a variance in the way things should be, a crack in the natural order of a place, one with no explanation or cause. Kiera's eyes drifted to the forest, trying to imagine such a thing for herself. It was as though another world was layered on top of their own, one that only immortal eyes were able to see. And this man, if that's what we're calling him. Jessie tilted his head, staring across the fire at the face. He will know what to do about the dragon. Eden drew in a soft breath. If anyone has ever seen such a creature, it would be him. His gaze rose to the others, clear as a midday sky. I believe it to be the best place to start. If you disagree, we can discuss it. The others stared back in surprise. Every word the Fae said was weighted with such history and authority, yet he treated himself as merely one of the three, surrendering the final decision to the verdict of the group. I wonder how many of his people would do the same. No, I think that's a good idea, Jessie said quickly, nodding his consent. If none of your kin have had dealings with the beast before, we must seek out someone even older. Kiera nodded just as fast. It's the best chance that we have. The Fae stared a moment longer, giving them a chance to add anything more. Then he nodded shortly and settled himself on the ground beside the fire. In that case, we should rest. We are only at the beginning of our travels, and there is a great deal further up ahead. Will you take the first watch? He added. Wake me at midnight. Jessie nodded automatically, then turned to Kiera with a little smile. Not me, he teased. This one was rather eager for a turn. She was about to shut him down automatically, laugh it off and curl up beside the fire, but a single look at his face and her pride spiked, propelling her back to her feet. "That's right," she said defiantly, taking the knife from her belt. "I certainly was." The Fae glanced between them, too tired for such games, then took a knife from his own belt and closed his eyes, content to simply fight for his life if something tried to attack in the night. Jesse glanced back at him with a grin before pushing to his feet. "Care for some company?" "Well-armed company? The kind of company that could fend off that vicious wolf pack when it inevitably returns for our heads?" She lifted her shoulders in a shrug. "I suppose." Together, the two friends walked a short ways to the edge of the forest and settled down on a grassy bluff, staring over the landscape below. The moon hung bright in a cloudless sky, and it was easy to see the length of the valley beneath them, a rolling blanket of violets and shadowed emerald, sliced with bright silver rivers and pockets of trees. Kiera stared in quiet wonder, amazed how far they'd travelled in a single day. "Things have been moving so quickly," she murmured. "It's almost strange when we stop. I feel like things haven't really stopped since I walked down the stairs of the tavern to start my shift." Jesse threw her a quick glance, arms draped over his knees. "I feel like that sometimes," he admitted. "When I left my village, I guess you could say I left it a bit of a hurry. The days start to blur together, one twisting into the next, and yet there are times when it feels like the world itself has stopped moving, and we're all just standing still." She nodded in silence, understanding this exactly. "Fortunately, we're travelling with someone who has no concept of time," she teased, "an immortal companion on an endless quest to find a man who was here when this place was nothing but primordial dirt. I don't think that feeling of surreal suspension is going away anytime soon." Jesse laughed quietly, throwing a look over his shoulder at the sleeping Fae. "Admit it. You're starting to like him." He laughed again, ready to deny it on principle, but a hint of that smile lingered on his face. "Actually, I like him a great deal. I'm not sure we could have found anyone at the stronghold I would have wanted to have come along more." He hesitated a moment, then flashed her a fleeting glance. "It feels like what you said, that the three of us found each other for a reason." Her cheeks warmed with a flush, but she held his gaze. "Are you going to tell him?" He let out a quiet sigh, turning back towards the valley. "I suppose I must." It hadn't made sense to confess such a thing before, when they were only going to be travelling together for 4 days, when they would likely be parting ways shortly after. But the vengeance of a wolf pack wasn't a casual problem, and the longer their paths intertwined, the greater the likelihood that kind of problem ceased to cling to a single person and tended to be shared. She stared with concern, then reached for his hand. "He would not punish you for it," she said quietly, "if that's what you're worried about. I don't believe for a single moment that he'd punish you for it." It was a risk, sure enough. While the Fae didn't rule the land outright, there was an authority to them all the same, and many times they had been called upon to deliver such justice. The slaughter of a wolf was a clear violation of pack law. One wolf, let alone 3. Yet having spoken with him, having seen the flickers of warmth behind his eyes, she couldn't imagine that Eden would act as judge and executioner. Having seen him fight that night in the forest, the protective rage behind his eyes, she couldn't imagine he wouldn't have done the exact same thing the shifter had done himself. Jesse pulled in another breath, then glanced down at their joined hands. "There is much we haven't discussed," he said simply. She tightened her fingers, staring out into the night. "Yes, there was." Chapter 3. Kiera didn't end up keeping watch that night. Her body was so tired and her reserves were so depleted, it didn't even occur to her to try. She fell asleep on Jesse's shoulder almost immediately after they finished talking, unaware when he wrapped his arm around her with a little smile. By the time she awoke the next morning, she was back at the camp, tucked safely in a blanket by the fire. "Good morning," Eden said cheerfully, sweeping back from the trees and tossing her a flask of water the second she opened her eyes. "How was it last night?" He'd been awake when the shifter carried her back shortly after midnight, lost to the world and draped obliviously over his arms. He'd even fished a blanket from his satchel and prepared a bed for her, grabbing his bow as Jessie tucked her in, sharing a conspiratorial smile. She suspected all this and decided to lie. "It was quite harrowing, if you must know." She took a dainty sip of the water, peeking at him over the top of the flask. "I had to frighten away a pair of coyotes. Probably saved your life." He nodded seriously, taking a drink for himself. "Those things can be a menace. It's exactly the reason why it's important for someone to keep watch. There is nothing more important than the safety of the group." "Right." She lowered her eyes with a flush, just in time to miss his teasing smile. But before she could say a word in reply, there was another sudden appearance as Jessie emerged from the forest. "You were right," he said without preamble, tying a cloak back around his neck. "There's a village just a few miles to the south. I couldn't get too close in case someone decided to take a shot at me, but it looks to be the kind of place where we could trade." "Take a shot at you?" Kiera stared up in alarm, before suddenly realizing what he meant. Every person who'd grown up in a village had been taught to fend off wolves, and the man had shifted. He was still in the process of redressing. His feet were bare. Eden tossed him a pair of boots. "There's no reason to trade. We have use for whatever supplies remain, and we haven't the time to stop and barter services. We'll buy what we need." An awkward silence followed this pronouncement. "I'm not—" Jessie trailed off, looking frustrated he was being made to say it so plainly. "I'm not in a position to be—" "I have coin," the face said shortly. His eyes flashed to the shifter, lingering there only a moment before returning to his flask. "Is there another reason we should avoid the village?" It was asked lightly, almost as an afterthought, but for a single horrifying second, the entire clearing went deathly still. Kiera's pulse quickened, and unless she was imagining it, Jessie's face had gone abruptly pale. He glanced away a moment later, lacing his boots and shaking his head. "No, nothing at all." Eden looked at him again, then nodded silently. "Good." He pushed to his feet, tossing the remains of his canteen to Kiera. "Like I said, there is nothing more important than the safety of the group." The village might have been only a few miles away, but the companions decided to hunt before they left. After doing so, they needed another fire to smoke the meat, at which point Kiera decided to wash the blood from the wolf attack out of their clothes, so that by the time they finally set foot in the village, the sun was already high and people were heading indoors for lunch. "It looks like they have a fine market," Eden said quietly, watching as a cluster of people busied themselves around the wooden booths scattered about the town square. "We can secure the room for one night at one of these taverns, then get what we need and set out at first light." The others nodded in agreement, falling into step beside him, only to be immediately waylaid by a pair of men who seemed to have materialized before their very eyes. They were both young and dressed in similar fashion, with superfluous frills added to the irregular clothes worn by others in the village. An added pocket, a fringed hem, an odd sort of collar that made it look as if their heads had been recently separated and were in the process of repair. "Pardon me for overhearing," one of them interjected eagerly, "but were the three of you looking for a place to stay the night?" The trio froze in surprise, watching as one man seamlessly took over for the other. "Because we happen to be the proprietors of the finest establishment in the village. Clean rooms, large tubs, guaranteed privacy. His eyes swept over Kiera, lingering a moment before returning to the men. Something adjoining for the lady? We could even throw in... He caught himself suddenly, registering the people in front of him. For a moment, it looked like he didn't quite believe what he was seeing. Then he reached blindly for his friend's jacket, temporarily speechless, openly gawking at the Fae. There was a moment of silence as he made a concerted effort to close his mouth. Or perhaps you'd be more inclined to share. The friends went collectively blank. It's just... The man stammered uncertainly, flashing a helpless look at his companion. It's just that you're all travelling together, and they say that immortals have a reputation for... The name of the tavern is the Gilded Lady, his friend interrupted swiftly, backing away whilst pointing to an inn at the end of the street. You can't miss it. Half the price of any other establishment in town, and very, very open-minded, if you get my drift. Kill me now. Kiera flushed the colour of burnt strawberries, while Jesse closed his eyes in a moment of what looked like physical pain. The only one who maintained his composure was the Fae himself. That's very gracious of you, Eden answered with a hint of amusement, waving them away in a clear yet casual dismissal. We'll keep it in mind. Thank you. The men nodded in unison, heads bobbing like deranged puppets. Then one of them jabbed the other in the chest, and they scampered quickly to the other side of the square, throwing excited looks over their shoulders and whispering behind cupped hands. A cool silence sprang up behind them, freezing the friends in the middle of the street. It went on for several excruciating seconds. Then Eden turned to the others with a dry smile. They've spoiled the surprise. I was hoping we could all sleep with each other. Jesse snorted with sudden laughter, fixing the strap on his satchel. Kiera's cheeks continued burning, but she found the horror melting away with an unexpected smile. Shall we? Eden gestured to the opposite end of the road, aiming for the first tavern that happened to catch his eye. That one looks promising. We're not going to the one they recommended, she interrupted in surprise. Both men turned towards her, raising their eyebrows at the same time. Not for that, she said impatiently. The man said it was half the price. Should we not at least check to be sure? It could help us save the coin for other things. Jesse looked like he was reconsidering, glancing back the way the men had pointed, but Eden shook his head with a faint smile. It's not half the price. Come, let's see what the other... How do you know? She interrupted again, struck by his certainty. There's a reason those two were sent out here to lure customers, and we could easily prove them wrong by checking for ourselves. They said it was half the price. How do you know they're not telling the truth? Eden drew in a patient breath, then pulled her a step closer. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. It's impossible to lie to a Fae. She blinked. That can't be true. Try me. At that point, Jesse stepped forward alongside her, staring doubtfully with his arms folded across his chest. I think you're a strong leader, and I'm proud to follow you. The Fae's eyes narrowed, and Jesse glanced at her in surprise. Perhaps there's something to it after all. Eden stalked off without another word to the tavern he'd selected, seemingly indifferent to whether they followed along or started constructing a booth for themselves. The others shared a quick grin, then hurried after him. One was armed with an apology, the other a wicked smile. Sure enough, every tavern in the little village was priced relatively the same. The friends asked at 3 of them before reserving a room at the one Eden had suggested from the road. It had been hours since they'd eaten, and their stomachs were clenched in hunger, but the second the key was in their hand, they walked back outside to see what they could gather before the sun went down. It was at that point they realized they had a slightly different priorities. What is that? Kiera came to a stop beside Jesse, staring in horror at the spiked instrument dangling from his hand. It was obviously a weapon of some sort, in that it was obviously made for killing people, but the design itself eluded her. In essence, it was a ball on a stick. But the blades? He glanced over his shoulder, giving it a casual swing. It's a toy for children. She blanched the colour of spoiled milk, and he recanted with a grin. The man tells me it's called a mace. He swung it again, listening as the blackened metal hissed through the air. I thought it might help us keep the Fae in line. Is that right? The two glanced up as Eden weaved his way through the crowd, carrying several new purchases of his own. They had split the coin bag evenly between them before setting off to explore, but while Jesse was interested in tools of death, the Fae had returned with mostly medicine. His eyes twinkled as they swept over the mace. Heaven knows I crave this structure. You really think that would do it? The shifter gave it another playful swing, grazing the front of the Fae's cloak. If nothing else, it puts a smile on my face. The Fae chuckled, taking a step back. You should definitely look into that. He turned to Kiera instead, before pausing with a slightly puzzled expression. And you? She blushed and glanced down at the two novels in her hand. One is a history of the realm thus far, she stammered, finding herself unable to meet their eyes. And the second is a compendium of all the vegetation we're likely to see along the journey. Things that are edible, things that are poisonous, things that can be used to make medicine, and where to find them in the forest. It's supposed to be quite good. It was compiled by rangers. She stared out with great enthusiasm, but her voice was barely audible by the end. Her eyes dropped to the ground, and she didn't see the look that passed between the others. Neither did she see the way their faces softened with affection as they stared between the girl and her books. You wish to bring those along on the journey? Eden asked with a hint of amusement. A trek that will span countless mountains and rivers. You wish to bring those books. She looked up swiftly, having already rehearsed her response. They can be quite useful, she said entreatingly. There's no telling how many times we can use the botanical guide, and if we're really crossing the entire realm just to speak to one of the oldest living occupants, would we not benefit as well by searching for any mention of the creature in the annals of history? There may be some reference to them, or a clue as to where they might be. The Fae's eyes twinkled, before he slipped the tinctures into his pack. Keep the history, lose the botany. He gave her a little wink, confiscating the mace at the same time and returning it to the cellar. I can tell you anything of the forest you wish to know. She beamed in triumph, murmuring under her breath, There are actually 2 histories. It was probably for the best that the men didn't hear the last bit. For the moment after the Fae had spoken, he'd turned suddenly to watch as a herd of horses was led down the road. Jessie followed his gaze, glancing back with a thoughtful expression. Do you have enough coin for that? In all likelihood, it wasn't a matter of coin, but a matter of terrain. Horses were by far the most expedient way to travel in the lowlands and the tamed areas of the realm, but they were no more than a liability on rocky slopes and crossing waters that went over their heads. Still, it was a strong temptation. We could steal them, Jessie suggested quietly. Eden stared a moment longer, then shook his head. Never steal a horse, he murmured. Something always goes wrong. With that, he set out back towards the tavern, content with the day's purchases and ready to get off his feet with a flagon of ale. The others set off immediately after him, but Kiera stopped almost as fast, realizing all at once the tremendous weight of her own purchases. Lash them to my pack. She lifted her head to see Jessie watching her. What? Lash them to my pack, he repeated irritably. If you want to keep them so badly, then lash them to my pack. You won't be able to carry them on your own. She brightened hopefully, slipping the smaller anthology inside the larger. They're not too heavy, just do it. With another beaming smile, she skipped around behind him and threaded them to his satchel with the leather cord that tied it shut. They dangled alongside his canteen and hatchet, making him look like the world's most bewilderingly studious traveller. He took a tentative step, then shot her a hard look. "They actually are rather heavy," she ventured tentatively. "They weigh a bloody ton." Chapter 4. The second the friends stepped into the tavern, Kiera pulled in a little breath, her pulse quickening automatically as the familiar array of sights and smells washed over her like a tide. It didn't seem to matter where one went in the realm. Every tavern was fundamentally the same. The clink of glasses, the bursts of laughter, the invisible panic of those rushing to keep up with the crowd. As she watched, a frazzled-looking bartender poured drinks with both hands whilst taking the order for 5 others. Another man was behind him, staring feverishly at a cauldron of stew. "Smells a lot better than ours did."
"Do you miss it?"
Eden asked softly, glancing down at the top of her head.
"It would be a difficult job, I'd imagine, but a strong sense of community all the same."
She cast another fleeting look around the room, then shook her head. "I'm just not used to being on the other side of the bar." A cool deflection, but she wasn't the only one bracing against the raucous clientele. Jesse had taken a single step inside the room, then froze where he was standing, those bright eyes sweeping over every patron with the same instinctual caution as the first day they'd met. He glanced at the others quickly, only to find the Fae was already staring at him. Perhaps it was for this reason that he volunteered to get the drinks.
"What would you like?"
he asked, following them to one of the furthest tables. Eden settled on the wooden bench, moving down to make room for Kiera.
"Ale, if they don't have something stronger."
The shifter nodded.
"The same for me," he murmured, before turning to Kiera as well. "And for you?"
She froze a second, then nodded quickly. "Sure, yes. Ale, that sounds wonderful." The men exchanged a look, then Jesse turned back with a grin.
"Are you sure? Big flagon of ale? That's what you'd like to be drinking."
"Could I have some juice?" The Fae looked deliberately at the table, while the shifter bowed his head with a sigh.
"I'll see if they have any."
With that, he left for the bar, weaving his way just as carefully through the clientele as the Fae had done himself. Kiera hadn't noticed it before, but now that they were alone at the table, it was hard to miss the way Eden was angling himself away from the majority of patrons, keeping his face turned from the general commotion, most likely to avoid more awkward conversations like the one they'd had before. At this point, she could hardly blame him, but it was hardly effective. There were already several that had spotted him, and he could clearly hear everything they had to say. "Do you miss it?" she asked, reversing his earlier question. "Farian, I mean, being in a place surrounded by your own kind. I doubt anyone in this village has ever seen a Fae." It was true. From the moment they'd stepped out of the forest, they had yet to see a single creature touched by magic. The village was almost as small and just as remote as Cattaling had been itself. The people who lived there had likely never seen a shifter either.
"I do not miss Farian," he answered quickly,
surprising her, though his eyes fixed with hard patience on the centre of the table. "But one never likes to be a spectacle." His shoulders tensed ever so slightly, and she glanced across the tavern to where a group of men was staring in open astonishment and speaking over empty flagons of their own. "What are they saying?" she asked curiously. He hesitated a moment, then looked up with a deliberate smile. "They are saying how beautiful you are." "No, they're not." A feeling of mischief swept over her, and she motioned him closer, leaning across the table so their heads were near touching. "I'm going to let you in on a little secret. It's impossible to lie to a bartender, much less a woman with red hair. Science cannot explain it." He let out a burst of laughter, leaning back with a genuine smile.
"Perhaps we'll find the answer in one of your books."
She grinned in reply, straightening back upon the bench. "So, what you said before, that it was impossible to lie to someone like you. She trailed off, hesitant to ask. I told you about the dragon. I wasn't lying, yet you still didn't believe me. He let out a quiet sigh, like he'd been waiting for the question. I thought you believed the story to be true. My kind sensed only intention. Your intention was pure. It made me feel for you. It made me think well of your companion. His eyes drifted toward the bar. I couldn't imagine he believed your story any more than I did. She stared a moment, then shook her head, speaking without thinking. Jesse has his own troubles. He would never judge me for mine. Eden flashed her a curious look, and she was suddenly reminded again they were fellow travellers, and not yet friends. By all estimation, they hardly knew each other. Also, in regards to what I said earlier, he added suddenly, that your words must always ring true. When you were teasing us earlier on the trail, you meant what you said, that you would like to share the burden, that you would like to shoulder more of the risk. She pulled in a breath, hands clenched beneath the table. Is this where you tell me such things are not for women? Some of the greatest warriors I've ever known have been women, he interrupted. I've fought alongside women in battle. My life has been saved by women more times than I could ever count. He regarded her thoughtfully from across the table. But they all knew what they were doing. Intention is not enough. You must be willing to learn. Again, she spoke without thinking. And would you be willing to teach me? He leaned back in surprise. Me? I thought you've been alive longer than anyone I've ever met, she interrupted, staring at him with wide, imploring eyes. You're as skilled in the forest as you are with a blade, and you wouldn't laugh at me for occasionally failing, unlike some shifters we both happen to know. She came to a pause, suddenly nervous. Would you teach me? He broke their gaze and stared out across the tavern, speaking almost to himself. It has been a long time since I've done such a thing. It has gotten to the point where everyone I know already has the skills for themselves. He considered another moment, then turned back to her suddenly, his eyes twinkling with an unexpected smile. I will most definitely laugh at you. She burst out laughing herself, then found herself holding her breath. Is that a yes? He stared a second longer, then inclined his head. It would be my honor. The two shared another lengthy smile, then just as suddenly turned away, breaking down those walls at a speed much faster than either of them had imagined. She was about to lean into it and teasingly suggest they sit at separate tables, but then she let out another snort of laughter. That your words must always ring true, she quoted, shooting him a sideways grin. Who talks like that anymore? How old are you? He ignored this, gaze drifting again to the bar. Old enough that I should have gotten the drinks. It was an exceptionally busy night, but Jesse had managed to secure himself a place at the counter, giving his order to the man tending bar before leaning back in his chair and watching as half a dozen similar orders were simultaneously filled. The other customers jostled around, talking in loud voices and occasionally crowding into his chair, but he didn't seem to mind. It wasn't until one of the groups beside him attempted to pay for their drinks that he had any problems. It happened completely by accident, an unfortunate combination of events. The bartender returned with ale just as the others tossed a handful of silver coins onto the counter. Jesse reached for the drinks, then reflexively jerked his hand away to keep the metal from touching his skin. It was subtle, fast, scarcely enough to notice, but those same men happened to be sitting extremely close. Their eyes widened in sudden understanding as the shifter reached obliviously for the ale, still waiting for the bartender to return with whatever juice he had managed to find for Kiera. Somebody doesn't like silver. It took a second, then Jesse glanced over in surprise. I'm sorry? In all likelihood, he hadn't noticed what had happened himself. An intolerance to silver was as fundamentally a part of wolves as taking a breath. Growing up, he'd learned to use other kinds of weapons, avoid certain kinds of coins. Most packs were so impoverished this never proved an issue. The man's eyes gleamed with drunken curiosity as he forgot about leaving and settled back in his chair. "I've heard stories about shifters in silver. Are they true? Is that what you are?" Jesse's face went still before he gestured to the bar. "I'm just waiting for my drinks." A casual diversion, polite yet brusque. It might have even worked if the people he was talking to hadn't consumed a barrel of mead between them. In a flash, they let out an excited whoop and surrounded the shifter's chair, craning for a glimpse while preventing any chance of escape. "The kid's a wolf," the man said loudly, as if the rest of his companions hadn't already heard the conversation. "Right here, a shifter. He couldn't touch the silver coin." The others were quick to pick up on the trail. "Let's see it then. Don't be shy. Show us. We'll hold the drinks. Come on, right here." Jesse stiffened involuntarily, then reminded himself to breathe. "I'm not a shifter." He tried to push his chair back, only to find 5 other men standing immediately behind him. The most he could do was stand, but even then they crowded him back against the bar. "Not a shifter, eh?" The man picked up the silver coin, tossing it casually in the air. "Then you wouldn't mind laying this back on the counter for me?" A chorus of dark laughter rang out around them, as Jesse went perfectly still, staring not at the coin but at the man, without a hint of expression. "You're drunk," he said quietly. "Move aside." Twice, it looked as though he pushed experimentally against the people crowding him, but twice he was pushed even harder back. They'd been drinking at the tavern for hours before the friends walked inside, and had already lost all sense of themselves. All reason was gone, replaced with a feverish excitement and the pack-like confidence of those who'd zeroed in on unsuspecting prey. "He couldn't touch it, or he wouldn't touch it." Another nodded in agreement, rubbing his beard. "My question exactly." "We want to see your trick." The man flashed a cocky grin and took a step closer, not stopping until he and Jesse were nearly touching. "It's rude to keep it from us." "Back off." The shifter raised his voice ever so slightly, eyes flashing with anticipation, though he kept all those primal instincts carefully under control. They were alone in this village with a group of people who'd spent their entire lives together. It was not the place to get lured into a clumsy tavern brawl. Unfortunately, such things weren't up to him. It happened before anyone could think to stop it. It happened so fast Kiera could have sworn the man had shifter blood himself. One moment he was standing with that awful smirk. A moment later, he'd lunged forward and raked that coin down the length of Jesse's face. "Holy shit!" A sudden cry rang out in the tavern, as painful as it was surprised. Kiera leapt to her feet with a gasp of horror, hands flying to her mouth, unable to believe things had escalated so abruptly. "Eden, we need to—" But the Fae was no longer there. By the time she registered his absence, he had already crossed the length of the tavern and cut to the center of the crowd. He took a single look at the shifter bleeding in front of him, one hand still pressed to his face in shock. Then he grabbed hold of the man who'd attacked his companion and slammed his head straight into the bar. Kiera felt the impact all the way on the opposite side of the room, wincing involuntarily as that sickening thud silenced every other sound in the tavern. The patrons turned at the same time to locate the source of it, most of them completely oblivious that anything had gone wrong, only to find the Fae still gripping the back of the man's neck, pressing his face against the sticky wood. "You wish to see the trick?" he demanded, wrenching the silver from the man's hand. "How much do you wager that I can push this coin straight through your head?" He touched it between the man's eyes. "Right here." A dangerous hush swept over the room as the man's friends hovered just beyond reach in silent panic. Some had reached for blades, but more of them seemed to realize that things would be of little use. It was one thing to torment a young wolf drinking on his own. but quite another to confront an enraged fae, especially one who had not yet begun drinking himself. Jesse peeled himself off the counter, bleeding freely down the side of his face. "Let's go," he said roughly, trying to steady himself. "Eden, let's go." The fae merely tightened his grip, fingers locked around the back of the man's head. For as beautiful as the fae could be, for as transcendent an experience it was to merely look at him, there was something abruptly frightening about him as well. Not so much in expression or posture, but in that ageless confidence, that sense of timelessness that overrode everything else. This was something he had done before. This was something he could do again. "I meant no offence," the man stammered, fingers clawing uselessly on the counter while he sucked in quick, terrified breaths. "I was only playing with the boy." Eden leaned down suddenly, speaking directly into his ear. "That boy has more patience than I do," he hissed. "He might have let you walk away from such insolence, while I am far more inclined to take your life." There was a terrifying pause, during which the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if that would happen, waiting to see if they would soon run screaming towards the door. Then he wrenched the man upright and tossed him back to his friends. "Be gone from this place, and hurry." His face was cold as carved stone, watching as they scurried away like rats from a sinking ship. "My people are a capricious sort. You never know when we might change our minds." They obeyed without a second's pause. A few of them drew those blades after all, but only in retreat, levelling them defensively at the fae's chest as they backed blindly towards the door. Eden stared back with a perfectly even expression, keeping a casual hand on the shifter at all times. It wasn't until the last of them had vanished into the cold that he glanced over his shoulder at the various drinks lined up behind the bar. A quick study, then one in particular caught his eye. "Ah." He reached across the counter and grabbed a bottle of whiskey, leaving the silver coin in payment on the blood-stained wood. "Looks like they had something stronger after all." As it turned out, the whiskey wasn't for drinking. It was for cleaning instead. "Hold still." Jesse winced and pulled free of the fae's grasp, only to be seized again and shoved straight back against the bedroom wall. After the skirmish in the tavern, the three friends had relocated to a different inn. Ironically, it was the same place they'd been pitched so enthusiastically before. "Hold still," the fae repeated, eyes locked on the wound. "There is an art to this." So far, that art was almost completely obscured in a torrent of profanities and blood. It had been hard enough convincing the shifter to let himself be treated, so difficult that he wasn't convinced at all, and in the end, the fae had to use threats and brute force. The wound itself wasn't particularly serious, but it was painful, and in a bad location. The silver had also left uneven tearing in the skin, keeping it from healing, keeping it from sealing shut. "I cannot believe they actually..." Jesse trailed off with a painful hiss, lifting his eyes to the ceiling as the fae used a cloth to sterilize the wound. "I haven't been touched with silver since I was a boy. There was always a bit lying around the village. As children, we used to dare each other to try." This was absolutely baffling to the others, but the fae only nodded, working as quickly and efficiently as possible. One hand was wrapped around the back of the shifter's head, angling it ever so slightly as the other disinfected every bit of shredded skin, preparing it to be sewn back together. This was easier in theory than in practice. "Damn it to hell!" the shifter cursed again. "Believe me when I tell you, I'd rather they had killed me 100 times over than whatever immortal nonsense you're doing with that cloth." Eden absorbed this without expression, never taking his eyes from the wound. "I'll keep that in mind the next time you get into trouble." He shook his head chidingly, dabbing at the blood. "Drawing attention to your heritage, forcing the spotlight." Jesse pulled back with true anger. "You can't be serious. Me, forcing the..." The Fae glanced up with a mischievous smile, and Jesse caught himself with a breath of wry laughter, surrendering to the ministrations with a reluctant smile of his own. You know how I crave a spotlight. Kiera was hovering on the floorboards just behind them, the only one who'd been unable to find even a hint of humor to lighten the mood. When it became clear she was too rattled to assist with the wound, or even speak without faltering, Eden had asked her to hold the candle instead. "Is it all right?" she asked shakily, ignoring their banter. "Does it look all right?" The smiles faded immediately as they glanced over at the same time, studying her face in the flickering light. A second later, Eden nodded kindly, angling his body to keep the worst from view. "It looks just fine," he said softly. "Can you hold the flame a bit higher?" She hastened to do as he asked, lifting the candle as the Fae finished cleaning and took a step closer to examine the damage himself. The stitches were already in place. He'd used less than he thought would be needed. The only thing left to do was secure a bandage. "And apply something that smells like violets." Jesse watched in silence as the Fae rifled through his pack and extracted one of the small vials he'd brought with them from Farion. There wasn't much, but he poured a generous amount onto his fingers, tilting the shifter's head carefully as he smeared it over the broken skin. "We should save that. Be quiet," Eden commanded softly, squinting in the candlelight to examine his work. When he was satisfied, he pressed a thin piece of gauze over the top. "How does that feel?" Jesse lifted a tentative hand, touching at the edges. "Better," he said, with a trace of surprise. "What is that?" "A salve that is known to my people," the Fae murmured, slipping it back into his pack. "It will make you very tired this evening, but should help with the sting." The shifter's eyes flashed up, staring for an unguarded moment. "Thank you." Eden nodded dismissively. "Of course, there is nothing casual about it," Jesse insisted softly, catching his sleeve. "You placed yourself between me and a crowd of people intending to do me harm, most of whom were drunk, most of whom were armed with blades. You did this without thinking. There is nothing casual about it." He hesitated a moment before continuing in a quiet voice. "You didn't have to do that. We don't even know each other." Silence fell over the room as they stared at each other in the dim light. It might have been a touching moment, one of those weighted memories that laid the foundations for something more. But there was nothing modest or sentimental about the look on Eden's face. If anything, he was staring back at the shifter with a trace of genuine frustration. "I didn't have to do it," he repeated with a bit of an edge. "We are traveling across the length of the realm in each other's company, hiking together each day, sleeping beside each other each night. We have committed to this journey, have we not? I didn't have to do it?" He let the question hang there a moment, then shook his head, looking abruptly tired. "I would have done it anyway, even if we had never met." Without another word, the Fae slipped a cloak back over his shoulders and headed towards the door, ignoring the astonished people in his wake. "Where are you going?" Kiera called out in alarm. He glanced back once he had reached the door. "For a little walk," he answered lightly. "I'll be back shortly. Lock the door." Chapter 5. When Eden had said the salve would make the shifter tired, he hadn't been exaggerating. Almost as soon as the Fae departed, Jesse murmured something about cleaning up the blood-stained towels, took a step towards the wash-bin, then almost fell over where he stood. Kiera rushed forward to help him, draping his arm over her shoulders as she lowered him gingerly onto the bed. His boots kicked off, and she half thought he was sleeping already, but the moment his head touched the pillow, he gazed up at her with a pair of lovely, drowsy eyes. "I'm sorry about tonight." She froze in surprise, still leaning over the mattress. "Why would you be sorry? You didn't do anything wrong." He shrugged his shoulders, blinking hard against the fatigue.
If I hadn't flinched away from the silver.
Those men attacked you, she interrupted, unwilling to discuss the possibility of an alternate perspective. You were sitting at the bar, and they sliced a giant tear down the side of your face. He stared at her a moment longer, then offered up a sad smile. I shouldn't have flinched away from the silver. He was asleep a moment later, before she could say anything to argue, before she could rant and rave about the injustice, before he could see her start to cry. Kiera had never planned on leaving. If she'd actually taken the time to think about what she was doing, she might have realized that she was afraid to leave the room by herself. But the moment the distant echoes of conversation went quiet, the moment the door was shut for the night, she found herself slipping back downstairs and into the deserted tavern, standing by herself in the middle of the floor. Places that were designed for such commotion always seemed especially quiet once that spirited chaos had gone, as if they had a greater capacity for silence, one that was repeatedly ignored. The walls themselves seemed to throb with it, pulsing like a living thing. Only when her eyes swept over them, corner to corner, did the entire room go abruptly still. It doesn't matter where you are in the realm, she thought again, turning in a slow circle. Every tavern is fundamentally the same. With that, she silently made her way to the bar, picked up a damp towel, and started cleaning. When asked about it later, she had no idea why she did it, or how long she was actually downstairs. It could have been minutes, or it could have been hours. She could have been living there for years doing the exact same thing, moving with slow repetition throughout the room until the process was complete. With meticulous precision, she went from table to table, wiping up the spills and stains, picking up the remnants of food, scrubbing ceaselessly at the wood until each surface reflected the filtered moonlight with a dull shine. Puddles of ale were mopped beneath chairs, and the pattern of muddy boot prints was slowly erased. The drips of candle wax were trickier, but Talbot had taught her an old trick, heating the edge of a blade before attempting to scrape them loose. She located one behind the counter and proceeded to make her way slowly across the room once again, carrying on in perfect silence until the entire place was spotless, until it smelled of warm air and soap, until it would have made even her fastidious employer proud. His voice echoed in her ears with every passing moment, mixing with the voices of so many others, people she'd grown up hearing, people who would never get the chance to speak again. More ale! That never-ending chorus, and then again with Talbot. Never save for tomorrow what could be done tonight. She carried on until the fire had burned down to embers, until her fingers were scraped and raw. When she was finally finished, she tossed the towel back onto the counter and walked slowly up the stairs, blowing the candles out behind her, wiping tears from her cheeks. The second she opened the door, a quiet voice called out in the darkness. "Where did you go?" She startled involuntarily, then closed the door behind her, padding swiftly towards the shifter across the length of the room. She didn't answer immediately, but climbed onto the bed beside him, reaching down without thinking and running her fingers through the length of his hair. "Sorry, I thought you'd fallen asleep." "I had," he answered softly, still hovering right on the verge. "But you shouldn't. After everything that happened tonight, you shouldn't." A little smile pulled at the corner of his lips. "That feels nice." She glanced down in surprise, then smiled herself, playing with a tendril that had curled alongside his cheek. The two hadn't spoken much since the night they'd shared in Farian. They'd spent that time eating undercooked rabbit and fighting off savage packs of wolves. But there was much to be said, if either of them could find the words to try. "I was downstairs," she finally answered his question, leaning back against the headboard and lifting her gaze to the distant sky. "There was something Eden said earlier, when we first came inside. He asked me if I ever missed it." The shifter flashed a quick look, then hitched himself up beside her, knees bent in front of him, that piece of gauze already stained through the center with the faintest hint of blood. "I'm sure he wasn't trying to upset you. He meant the profession, not the—" "I know what he meant," she interrupted swiftly, flashing a tight smile. "I was just—" A moment of silence hovered between them. "Jesse, do you ever miss where you came from? When I saw you laying flowers in the forest, you said it had been 1 year to the day. That's a long time to have been away from home." He blinked quickly, trying to focus past the cloying herbs. "You mean, do I miss my old life?" "I don't mean your old life. I mean the village itself. The place, the people. You shifted at a young age, entered the pack at a young age. Do you ever miss all that?" He considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Life in the village was hard, even more so after my parents died, and it was only me and He caught himself, unwilling to say his brother's name. "When I let myself think on it, that is the feeling which overwhelms every other. Life in the village was hard." She cast him a sideways look. "This will be hard too, but in a different way," he said suddenly. "There is hope in it. There's a purpose to what we're doing, the sense that we might actually help people. In my village there was never—" He trailed away, then glanced down at the top of her head. "No, I don't miss it." She froze beside him, then let out a breath. "Neither do I." A pair of tears slipped down her cheeks as she curled up her knees as well, staring with quiet despondency out the window. It was a feeling that had clawed at her since she dragged herself away from the ruins of Cattaling, growing more and more unsettling with each step that took her further away from that scorched wasteland she used to call her home. For whatever reason, her time downstairs in the tavern had confirmed it. Just another tavern, just like any other. "I never had any family," she whispered. "I never had any close friends. I cared about the people there. My heart aches for them every day. But my life in the village? I don't miss it." It was quiet for a few seconds. Then she stared up at him. "Is that terrible?" He considered for a lengthy minute, then wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing them closer on the bed. They sat there in silence, staring out that window together. "You are not required to miss it," he said softly. "You are required only to grieve." They stayed like that for a long while, propped up together on the headboard. The shifter dozed in and out. Such a thing was beyond his control, but she kept her eyes on the window, watching the slow curve of the moon, watching the gradual brightening of that star-dusted sky. It wasn't until several hours later that Jesse opened his eyes once again, only to find her standing beside the window, gazing at the deserted street with a slightly anxious expression. "What's wrong?" She started again, glancing over her shoulder. "Eden isn't back yet. At this point I don't know if we should be worried or—" She trailed off into silence, chewing nervously at her lip. "Do you think he's found someone for the night?" Jesse's eyebrows rose in surprise. "What?" She turned back to the window with a flush, the salesman's words ringing in her ears. "Is it true, what those men said? Do immortals have a certain reputation?" In perhaps the worst bit of timing in her young life, the door opened at that very moment, and the Fae swept back inside. She'd said the words quietly, aware there were other people in the tavern trying to sleep, but there wasn't a doubt in her mind that he'd heard them. As if there was any remaining doubt, he unfastened his cloak with a twinkling smile. "I believe those men were speaking not to our willingness to engage in such activity, but our unparalleled talent when we do." He paused what he was doing and lifted his eyes slowly to the friends, staring with such an expression that both started laughing in spite of themselves.
"At any rate, if you've decided the three of us should share that bed together, we should at least eat first."
He threw an appraising glance at Jessie.
"And you should probably stop bleeding."
The shifter laughed again, holding obediently still, while the Fae peeled back the gauze with gentle fingers and checked on the stitches. Once he was satisfied, Kiera blew out the candle, and the three of them settled down for what remained of the strange and unexpected night. 2 were on the bed, and 1 was sitting in a chair that was casually angled to face the door. Jessie was already dozing, gripped hard in the power of the drugs, but Kiera lifted her head with a quiet whisper. "You should join us." Eden raised his eyebrows in surprise. "You should sleep," she clarified with a tired smile. "It might be your only opportunity in the next few weeks to rest on an actual bed." The Fae's eyes warmed with affection as they travelled the length of the others. Then he shook his head.
"I'm fine right here. You keep an eye on him."
A faint smile pulled the edges of his lips as he turned back to the door.
"I have a feeling you're quite good at that."
She wanted to argue. Seeing his silhouette on the stiff chair felt profoundly unfair, but only a few seconds later she drifted off to sleep herself, falling into a tangle of restless and unsettled dreams. It was fortunate that she hadn't stayed at the window any longer. Otherwise she might have seen the group of beaten men dragging themselves back into the village. She might have looked upon the Fae with new eyes, realizing that perhaps he could act as judge and executioner after all. Their friends got up early the next morning, opening their eyes just at the breaking of dawn. There was a slight commotion downstairs in the tavern. The owner of the establishment had woken only to discover someone had already finished all the work he'd left himself from the night before, but they didn't stick around to see it. After packing their things and settling the bill, they made their way down the street towards the forest just as the merchants were opening the first of the booths. Kiera looked at them longingly, thinking of all the things they'd yet to buy. "We could still get a tent, you know." It was not the first time she'd raised the subject. It would not be the first time she was shut down. But given the fact that they were leaving, she decided to try once more.
"Would you carry it?" Eden asked lightly.
She glanced at Jessie for help, but the shifter deflected her with a curt,
"I can scarcely hear you over the weight of all these books."
The Fae chuckled under his breath as she trailed along behind them. "So we're just going to be out in the open," she pressed, trying not to imagine the countless leagues it would take to get to wherever they were going. "Nothing between us and the stars." Jessie cocked his head with a grin. "Sounds rather poetic when you say it like that." She ignored this. "Every night, every day, in all kinds of weather." She waited for some kind of response, but they gave her the same blank look. "I mean, what if it rains?" There was a momentary pause.
"We'd probably wake up."
"So very helpful." She continued walking beside them, then suddenly turned and folded her arms across her chest. "What about predators?" she demanded. "Wolves? Snakes? Bears? Bugs?"
"You think a bear is going to be dissuaded by a piece of fabric?" Jessie asked with a laugh. "I think you have drastically overestimated our chances."
"What about privacy?" she interrupted, staring them up and down. "I'm a young woman, travelling on her own with 2 men. I need a bit of privacy." The friends bought a tent. They all slept in it together. Kiera unpacked her things with a secret smile, throwing quick glances across the little space as the others did the same thing. It was smaller than she'd imagined, even though they'd purchased one of the largest options in the town. It was smaller still when they tried to squeeze 3 people with hefty travelling packs inside, but it was so much better than the alternative, so she held her tongue. At any rate, there would usually be only 2 people inside.
"I'll take the first watch," Eden said briskly.
making a habitual assessment of his arrows before slinging the quiver across his back.
"There was a gorge we spotted a few miles back. I'm wondering if we should cross it. The slope of the mountains is getting much higher, and if we—"
"Wait." Jesse caught him suddenly by the sleeve, looking a bit nervous to have done so. The two stared at each other a moment, then he pulled in a faltering breath and forced himself onward.
"There's something I must tell you."
"Why did I insist on a tent?" Kiera's pulse quickened in sudden panic as her eyes darted to the door. Both men were standing directly in front of it, blocking even the most casual opportunity for escape. But under no circumstance could she imagine just standing in the corner and witnessing what would happen next. Eden flashed her a quick look, then lowered the quiver back to the ground.
"All right."
The shifter drew in another breath, staring not at the Fae himself, but at the space between them. When he finally managed to speak, it was in a voice much quieter than his own.
"I was not forthcoming about the circumstances of our meeting. How it was that I met Kiera and came to Farian in the first place. I made it seem as though I was a mere traveller, in the right place at the right time, but that wasn't the case. The truth is—" He paused in spite of himself, flashing a quick look at the Fae. "The truth is that I am a criminal, exiled from my pack." Eden remained impassive, waiting for the rest. "I murdered 3 men," he continued softly. "Men I had known all my life, young men like myself. I beat them to death in a fit of rage. It was over before I was aware it had even begun."
"Tell him why." Never had it occurred to Kiera that he might feel residual guilt about their deaths, describing them as young men, reminded of their shared history. In her mind, such a thing was so indisputably justified, she could imagine feeling only the bitterest of rage and the bitterest of grief. But perhaps he couldn't help but humanize them. Perhaps that was the crucial step they'd been missing themselves. "It doesn't matter. Tell him why."
"They had been sent by our pack, Master, to take the life of my little brother, a boy of just 10 years. The sweetest boy you could imagine, but he was slightly touched in the head. A pack does not allow for such things. I found him lying on the ground at their feet."
Silence. Kiera remembered the moment when she first heard the story, the sickly burning in the pit of her stomach, the pulsing ache buried deep in her chest. Her eyes flashed swiftly from one man to another, but she couldn't tell if Eden was feeling any of those things. Throughout the entire tale, the Fae had betrayed not a hint of expression. He simply stood in front of the door, staring in silence as the shifter delivered his soft-spoken confession, that quiver of arrows still resting by his feet. "What you said earlier at the tavern," Jesse finished softly, "that we have committed to this journey together, that we are bound to one another until it is complete. You have a right to know." His gaze lifted at last, coming to rest on the man standing across from him. Unapologetic, yet sorry, frightfully aware that the next few steps would not be up to him. Eden drew in a breath of his own, gathering his thoughts.
"I'm sorry," he finally murmured. "I'm so deeply sorry for your loss."
Kiera was frozen just a few steps behind them, feeling as though she was poised on the edge of a blade. Such sentiment was no guarantee against a harsh ruling. The sentence had already been given, and the Fae were nothing if not fair. A life for a life, and the shifter had taken 3. "You knew," Jesse replied suddenly. "As we were leaving the forest, you asked if there was a reason to avoid the village. I denied it, but then you said it's impossible to lie to a Fae."
"I knew there was something," Eden admitted. "I've known there was something since we left Farian, but I would not have guessed it was this."
"So what happens now?" The Fae let out a quiet sigh, then reached for his quiver. At the same time, Jesse flinched, same as he'd done with the silver, his own hand flying reflexively for his braid. Eden froze in genuine surprise, staring back at him. "You think I mean to kill you?" Jesse stared back, keeping his grip on the handle, though it seemed harder and harder for him to do so, given the look of profound sadness in his companion's face. "It was the sentence they handed down," he answered roughly. "The Fae have a reputation for aiding in these matters. I couldn't be sure you wouldn't carry it out yourself." Time slowed to a crawl between them, each moment stretching longer than the last. When it finally reached a breaking point, Eden picked up the quiver and slung it over his back. "You avenged the life of a sweet boy," he murmured. "One who deserved the chance to grow up and live that life for himself. You will never have anything to fear from me." Kiera turned her face quickly, trying to rein in her emotions, while Jesse's hand fell back to his side. "I apologize," he blurted as the Fae headed for the door. "Truly, I'm sorry." Eden glanced back in surprise. "For what?" "It was dishonest," Jesse said simply. "Traveling together without revealing the risk." The Fae held up a silencing hand. "Never apologize. Not to me or any other. Not for anything to do with this." He started to say something more, then shook his head. "We will speak on it no further." The shifter watched as he pulled back the flap. "A few days ago you cursed me because I didn't reveal an injury that may have compromised us. This is much worse. A few days ago I cursed you because I wanted to curse you," Eden replied shortly before suddenly meeting his eyes. "And I did not yet know the man to whom I was speaking." The others froze in stunned silence as he took a step outside, unable to believe the matter was settled, unable to believe the conclusions the Fae had drawn. Eden took another step, then glanced over his shoulder. "Your brother, what was his name?" Jesse took a second to collect himself. "Emery." The Fae nodded in silent recognition. "My people have a name like that as well," he said softly. "It's one of the oldest that we have, passed down in the ancient tongue. From what you've said of your brother, it suits him." The shifter merely stood there, silent tears running down his face. "What does it mean?" There was a moment of silence. "It means home." Chapter 6. Things were never the same after that day. The friends hunted together, slept beside each other, spent countless hours travelling under the same sun. But there was no longer any distance between them. That time had passed. It had been replaced with something rather unique. Kiera jerked awake with a gasp as a sudden hand clamped over her mouth. It was paired immediately with a silver knife that pressed to the soft skin beneath her neck. "Pray to your gods, mortal, though I doubt they can save you." Charming. She covered her face with a groan, snorting with laughter at the same time. When she hitched onto her elbows, the blade vanished from her throat, but didn't disappear. It hovered like a silent warning between them, its shivery glow reflecting in the Fae's bright eyes. "Oh good," he said cheerfully. "You're awake." She glared up at him in the dewy light, deciding to pray to those gods after all. "Speak to me, great spirits," she muttered, "creators of life and light. In your divine wisdom, please tell me why I ever asked this foul creature for a favor." Eden's eyes twinkled as he offered down a hand. "Just feeling especially intuitive, I guess." She took it with the greatest reluctance, making a half-hearted swipe for the blade. "Just for my own clarity, you get that when a person communes with the heavenly powers, they aren't actually talking to you, right?" "It's easy for us to get confused," he replied graciously, hoisting her to her feet. "Now come on, get dressed. We have a long day's hike ahead of us. This is the only time for your lessons." It had been 5 days since they'd left the village, 5 days since she'd extracted a promise from the Fae to aid her in her mission. Each evening, she'd cast him a secret look across the fire, trying to build up the courage to ask if they could start. Each evening, she'd promised herself that the next evening would be the time she'd actually do it. A rather pathetic tradition, but now that the moment was upon her, she found herself suddenly wishing she'd never opened her mouth in the first place. "I've reconsidered my lessons," she said promptly, slipping a cloak around her shoulders at the same time. "I've decided to preemptively quit. Or you could just preemptively surrender." He nodded along, yanking the cloak off again. "Tie back your hair." "I'm serious," she added with a flutter of nerves. "Think of how great I already was when we were fighting those wolves. That one that leapt upon me, I stabbed it straight in the chest." The Fae pursed his lips sympathetically. "The wolf didn't leap upon you," he corrected kindly. "It had some kind of heart attack, stumbled and died. I can only imagine the process was made infinitely more terrible when you started shrieking beneath it and poking around with your blade." "To be fair, that's not outside the realm of possibility." "Why are you stalling?" he continued with a sudden grin. "This was your idea. You were the one who needed to convince me at the tavern." "And now I'm frightened of you," she answered plainly, twisting her hair into a long braid like he'd asked. "Now I'm deciding that I don't want you to beat me up after all." "Nonsense," he scoffed. "That part is all good fun. Don't forget the bandages," he added as an afterthought, as if the two were somehow unconnected. She stared across the tent in silence, lacing up each boot at such a glacial speed that the Fae grew tired of waiting and swept back outside. The moment he did, she grabbed one of those rolls of gauze after all, slipping it into the pocket of her trousers and praying it wouldn't be needed. One prayer to the gods, and one prayer to the Fae. Just in case. The sun was just beginning to peek through the trees when Kiera stepped out of the tent and joined the Fae in the clearing. Rays of filtered light hung suspended in the air, twinkling with tiny particles of mist as a thick layer of dew soaked immediately through her boots. She shivered against the chill, longing for her cloak. "Where's Jesse?" He could stop this madness." "Still running the perimeter," Eden answered briskly, sorting through his blades. "We have a little time." His eyes flashed up with sudden mischief. "I'm guessing you don't want an audience." "I want a priest." "Which one is for me?" she asked instead, glancing over his shoulder. He straightened suddenly, placing them all securely in his pack. "None of them. We're not going to start with weapons. If you wish to defend yourself, you'll learn to do it first with your bare hands. From there, we can move to other things." She tilted her head, watching him. "If I wish to defend myself," she repeated slowly, "I told you that I want to be an asset. I told you that I want to learn how to fight." He turned to face her, dropping the satchel on the ground. "Do you wish to learn how to attack, or how to protect the people you hold dear?" he asked a bit sharply, staring with sudden intensity into her eyes. "There is a great difference between those two things, and one you must consider carefully. To protect others, you must first learn to defend yourself. That is something I would be glad to teach you. If you wish to learn how to initiate a fight, to arm yourself with blades and act as the aggressor, then our instruction has come to an end." A ringing silence fell between them. Much as she'd come to learn about the Fae, there was something rather paradoxical about them. They safeguarded the realm against danger, but wanted little to do with its inhabitants. They built their lives upon the premise of harmony, yet had spent more centuries than any other group of people living on the edge of a blade. They were characterized by an ethereal beauty and refinement, but Eden had spent much of the previous afternoon singing sea shanties at the top of his lungs. "Intention," she quoted with a little smile. "Intention is everything." He gave her a smile in return. "When you're throwing punches, yes. Even more so when you're swinging a blade. First lesson, Kiera. Always know why you are fighting. Most often, it is better to walk away. She stared at him a lengthy moment, then nodded. Then let us begin. Without a backwards glance, the Fae left the camp behind and moved a little way into the forest. She followed after him curiously, surprised when they stopped in another clearing no bigger than the one they'd just left. It wouldn't be until later that she realized the reason for the change. It was much harder to land on packed dirt than it was to be cushioned by the soft grass. Show me your stance. She flashed a nervous look, embarrassed not to know what he meant. He regarded her with eternal patience, taking great care not to smile. How would you stand to fight me? Without stopping to think, she widened her feet and squared her shoulders, trying to look as intimidating as possible considering she weighed about as much as the Fae's satchel. A look of fierce determination swept over her, and she lifted both hands, tucking her thumbs inside each fist. He waited until she was finished, then swept forward with a faint smile. What is it? She demanded as he began moving her like a doll. You stand like someone who learned to fight in a bar, he answered quietly, making tiny adjustments all the while. Drunks are sloppy and careless. A wide stance is death in a fight. She frowned uncertainly, glancing down as he turned her hips. But won't I fall over otherwise? Not if you use this leg for balance. He tapped her knee, sliding it back a few inches, then rotating her entire body so she was virtually sideways. There, much better. Really? A part of her thought that he might simply be messing with her, but he backed away a few steps and assumed a similar position himself. You want to present the smallest target possible, he explained, exaggerating the stance so he was only a slice of a man against the wide backdrop of the forest. If you come at me straight on, I have a dozen vulnerable places you might strike. Like this, you have only a few options. He waited until she nodded, then beckoned her forward. Tell me what they are. With a touch of caution, she crossed the space between them, coming to a stop just a few feet away. He suddenly appeared much taller than she remembered, and she was hyper-aware that his fists were lifted as well. But he didn't use them. He merely stood there as she lifted a hesitant finger and pointed to various places on his body. The face, the neck, the side. He nodded approvingly, reaching suddenly to squeeze the back of her knee. Here as well. Do you feel this? How sensitive? Her head jerked up and down. If you manage to land a strike in one of these places, it will give you the time you need to do the smart thing when faced against a person who wishes you harm. There was a slight pause. And what is that, Kiera? She tentatively lifted her gaze to his face. I should run. You should always run. He let that sink in a moment before flashing a sudden grin. Except on those rare occasions you litter the earth with pieces of your enemies. Spoken like a true Fae. She grinned as well, unable to contain it. Let's focus on that part. In a moment. He dropped his own stance and stepped forward with a frown. What is happening with your fingers? She glanced down in surprise, unable to see anything wrong. What do you mean? I'm making a fist. He opened his mouth with what was sure to be a memorable reply, took a single look at her face, then closed it again with a gentle smile. Untuck your thumbs. But they'll be broken. I will break them on principle if they stay. Untuck your thumbs. She untucked her thumbs. Good. Now, a person of your size and strength will generally have roughly 3 options in a fight. You could surprise me. You could seduce me. He paused a moment, giving her a chance to do just that. Or you could learn to take advantage of even the slightest opportunity. Her head tilted with a wry smile. I'm guessing it's the third option? It was the second, he said shortly. But because the idea did not immediately occur to you, I hereby refuse all seduction forthwith. She snorted with laughter. Glad we've gotten that out of the way." He smiled along, but it faded quickly. "Do you remember how it felt when the wolves attacked?" he asked quietly. "The way your heart started pounding and the world around you seemed to stand still." She sucked in a quick breath, remembering it more clearly than she'd have liked. The world might have slowed down for the Fae, but to her it had been racing, speeding to a pace beyond imagination, while she was the one standing still. She remembered the incapacitating fear. That was the only word for it. Incapacitating. She was unable to do anything but watch and wait for whatever terrible things might happen, unable to influence any kind of change. "I remember," she said softly. The Fae stared down at her, pulling the words straight out of her head. "When you're fighting someone, especially as a young woman, that fear will be one of the first things used against you. Men will expect you to cower. They will expect you to freeze." He tilted his head suddenly, catching her gaze. "They will be wrong." The two locked eyes, sharing a fleeting smile. "You overcome that fear, then you are suddenly on equal footing. A fight isn't about size or strength or speed. There are ways to leverage all of those things. The true battle is right here." He touched a finger between her eyes. "Keep your head clear. Remember what you want." They stared at each other a moment, then he motioned for her to raise her hands. "Now, take a breath." There was no further warning than that. The moment the words touched her ears, the Fae was upon her. Not from the front, like she was expecting, but circling around behind. In a sudden, violent motion, he yanked her straight off her feet, one hand wrapped around her stomach, the other gripped tight around her neck. It was frightening. It was jarring. It was over before it had begun. Her windpipe closed down, silencing what might have been the start of a scream. She struggled for a brief moment, a useless, involuntary gesture, before freezing perfectly still. "This was a mistake. I want nothing to do with this." The words pounded ceaselessly against her skull, like they were trying to escape. She drew in a quick breath, trying to find the sense to tell him, only to feel his cheek press suddenly against hers. "There it is again," he spoke quietly, straight into her ear. "That panic, that fear. I know it feels hopeless, like the fight is already lost, but it isn't." His fingers tightened on her neck. "What do you want to happen?" She trembled violently, thrashing in his arms. "I am stronger and faster than you," he continued softly, holding her as easily as a child swung around a doll. "You will not get away like that. Think, Kiera. What do you want?" His grip loosened ever so slightly, allowing her to speak. "I want you to let go of me," she gasped. "I want this to be over." "You want to be able to protect yourself," he corrected, keeping her pressed hard against his chest. "You want to make me let go. You want to end it yourself." I can't, she panted, clawing frantically at his hand. "Eden, that's enough." "Take a breath," he murmured, somehow comforting in spite of all the rest. "Take a breath and tell me what you want to happen." The Fae was right. The fear was overwhelming. From the moment he grabbed her, it had swept over her like a drug, paralyzing her body so it no longer answered to her command, locking down the reasoning centers of her brain until he tapped lightly between her eyes once again. "Remember, this is the fight. What do you want to happen?" For a terrifying second, her mind went completely blank. Then the answer flew unbidden from her mouth. "I want to throw you off." There was no way for her to see, since the Fae was behind her, but she was suddenly certain that he smiled. His body shifted ever so slightly, revealing the uneven distribution of his weight. "Show me." For the next hour, the two friends stampeded around the clearing, cheerfully beating at each other while calling out increasingly ludicrous threats. Once Kiera had broken through that initial psychological barrier, the Fae's lessons had become basic and physical, demonstrating the most common ways to incapacitate someone, and then taking her slowly through the steps to avoid them. Most of them were quite simple. Most of them she had seen before. He would come up behind her, wrapping an arm around her throat, then explain how his balance in such a stance was limited, and show her how to shake him loose. He would pin her against the base of a tree, wrapping both hands around her neck, only to recreate the scenario quickly in reverse, sliding his arms to the side, then abruptly swinging them down to break her grip. As the lesson progressed, she began to realize that there was nothing especially difficult or impossible about mastering these fundamental things. She'd always assumed such battles were won by other people, by bigger people, when the key was only to think clearly and practice. And practice, and practice, and practice. The Fae could not have emphasized this more times, and his own practice was clear to see. There was something so different about seeing him there in the forest, haloed in sunlight and flying through the trees, than the night they'd fended off the wolf pack. That fight was bloody, choppy, obscured by night shadows and blanketed in a heavy layer of smoke. She'd spent most of it lying on the ground, and the rest of it screaming. At any rate, she felt the benefits of the Fae's actions more than she'd been able to track how they were actually done. Not like here. The fear may have been compartmentalized, but her own dizzied distraction was an equal liability. A great many times her arms drifted back to her sides, and she found herself simply staring in wonder, unable to comprehend how two such different people could walk the same earth. There was a light to him that transcended any other, a beauty that dipped in and out of reality, blending fact and fiction, making her believe in things like fairy tales, and that his people truly came from the magic of the stars. The fight itself he made seem effortless, flying around the sunlit clearing with such astonishing grace that one could only stand there, mute and amazed. It was as if the earth itself couldn't hold him, relinquishing its claim whenever the mood suited, whenever he'd tilt those enchanting eyes towards the heavens and propel his body into the sky. It was only when she felt the sudden impact of his landing, when those violent vibrations rattled up through her shoes, that a whispering chill swept over her, and those fledgling fists flew right back up again, doing everything in their clumsy, awkward power to fend him off. She stood no greater chance than a mouse facing off against a lion. But, above all things, Eden was kind. It was something she was quickly coming to learn about him. That inherent empathy guided his every decision, making him speak instead of ignore, making him care instead of detach. It was the reason he'd found himself in the woods, teaching a barmaid to throw punches. "Excellent, Kiera, that's very good." Her feet tumbled out from beneath her, and she found herself falling headlong into a cluster of brambles she hadn't noticed before. The thorns were thick, yet blunted, snagging irritatingly on her clothes, while leaving her face and hands unharmed. Her pride was another matter entirely. "Those words must mean something quite different in Fae," she called, clutching onto the twisting branches and hoisting herself free. "In the common tongue, we'd say something along the lines of, 'Oh, you poor dear, shall we send for a healer?'" A burst of laughter rang bright through the trees as two hands grabbed the backs of her arms and pulled her to safety. Strong, yet gentle. Another paradox. No matter how fast things were moving or how violent the fight had become, she was never in any real danger. As long as she stayed within his presence, it was hard to imagine that could ever change. "You should also know that I've changed my position," she added grudgingly, picking handfuls of leaves from her hair. "I henceforth side with the aggressors and wish to be taught accordingly. Someone needs to put lunatics like you in their place." He laughed again, as was his custom. "Lunatics like me? Glad to see you've picked a side." "There is only one side, and I shall set those limits myself," she muttered murderously, balling a pine cone in her fingers and waiting for an opportunity to throw. "Oh look, a squirrel!" He ignored this, glancing back towards the camp. "Tomorrow we shall begin work with a bow," he murmured, speaking as though she was no longer there. "It's well enough to be able to defend yourself, but I would never wish for you to get so close. We must teach you to remove threats from a distance, catch your opponents by surprise." "Like this?" In a flash, the pine cone left her fingers, flying straight as an arrow towards the side of the Fae's face. With a flick of his fingers, he caught it, turning with an expression that gave her chills. "Did you lose something?" Her stomach jumped into her throat, and she could do nothing but watch as it crumbled to dust in his hands, replaying every previous conversation, wondering if they were actually that close. "Yes, I must have dropped it," she felt the need to add. "My mistake." It was quiet for a moment, then his lips twitched in amusement. "It appears we must add another lesson," he remarked. "You must train yourself to weigh the odds of a situation before rushing in head first." She bit down on her lip, trying not to laugh. "The odds of my winning?" "The odds of your survival. There are many things worse than death." Yikes. "So remember way back when I decided to throw that pine cone? Yes, let's move on." He waved her forward, wiping the remnants on the back of her shirt as the two of them clashed playfully together, then paced back into position once again. "Is that what you did as well?" she called out suddenly. Her cheeks flushed pink as her heart ran wild in her chest. "You trained yourself first to weigh the odds of every situation?" He glanced over his shoulder, then flashed a little grin. "I trained myself not to." They continued fighting for a while longer, playing out each scenario at glacial speed, as though they'd been submerged in a mud. He would extend his arm in a slow-moving punch, and she would duck under it, taking a split second to weigh her options before pressing her knuckles into the sides of his ribs. He would nod his approval, then come at her from a different angle, keeping up a quiet monologue of instructions as they battled their way across the grass. It was slow progress, but the Fae was a patient teacher. Whenever she found herself off balance or her limbs grew tangled, he would calmly wait until she righted herself, before explaining what had gone wrong. It was like a story, the way he described it, one she could fill in herself. "Who taught you to do this?" she asked abruptly, failing to find a way out of his chokehold and deciding simply to bite him on the wrist. "To fight, I mean. Who taught you?" There was an almost imperceptible pause. "Many people taught me," he replied. A casual deflection, but she happened to be pressed against the front of his body. As such, she happened to have felt the way every muscle stiffened the second the question left her mouth. "Many people, eh?" she teased, digging her heel into the top of his boot. "It takes a village?" He flung her into a nearby tree. "Something like that." Ow. She peeled herself painfully from the bark, casting a silent look over her shoulder. As warm as the Fae could be, there was still a cool distance to him. Walls so thick and high, she sometimes wondered if she would ever see it to the other side. "Not today, apparently." "Many people taught me as well," she said sagely, shaking a cloud of pine needles from her hair. "What you're seeing now is a culmination of all their skills. I'm making them proud." He nodded slowly, watching as she approached. "Do they examine the trees as closely as you?" She paused mid-step, scraping a glob of sap from her cheek. "They have a great many talents," she said loftily, raising her fists once again. "And they are not nearly so evasive as you." "Evasive?" he laughed, dodging her first swipe. "I have answered everything you asked, and you ask a great deal," he added swiftly. "I've never known a girl so tireless in her examinations." She swung again, flashing a grin at the same time. "Perhaps I'm simply getting to know a new friend. Is that so wrong?" "There is a fine line between a friend and an enemy," he teased, swatting her upside the head a bit more sharply than he'd done before. They bleed just the same. Instead of scrambling for some clever quip, she dropped abruptly to her knees, lifting a quaking palm to the back of her head. A ripple of false pain tightened her forehead, and she closed her eyes with a quiet exhaling of breath, holding a finger between them. "Just give me a moment," she panted, swaying for balance. "Sometimes you immortals don't know your own strength." It may have been impossible to lie to a fae, but this was not a lie. It was a simple exaggeration, perhaps untimely, but one that had strong roots in the truth. In a flash, Eden knelt to the ground beside her, his eyes widening in surprise. "Sweet girl, I'm so sorry." He reached instinctively towards her, then lowered both hands deliberately to his sides. "It was never my wish to—" He trailed into silence, staring in bewilderment at her sudden smile. "Another of my talents. Try to keep pace." There was a brief moment of silence, long enough for the pulse of a heart. Then the Fae was upon her once again, forgetting all lessons and structure as he simply pried her arms away from her body and barreled her into the ground. There were shrieks of laughter, his and hers, echoing loudly from the greenlit canopy above them. Too long had it been since he'd engaged in such antics, and she couldn't remember if she'd ever gotten the chance. It carried on for a long time, his teasing punishments and her shrieks for mercy. Neither of them heard the quick approach of footsteps. Neither saw as another person emerged from the trees. "I hope I'm not interrupting." A voice echoed loud in the clearing, louder even than their laughter, and the girl and the Fae sprang away from each other, flushed and still smiling. Jesse was standing in the shadow between two trees. He was smiling as well, but only to match their own. It didn't reach his eyes. "I have decided to do away with her," Eden said without explanation, shoving her to the ground once more as she pushed to her feet. "We can continue north without her." The shifter's eyes cleared slightly at this. "Oh yes. Did she try again to whistle?" She looked up with a start. "What's wrong with my whistling?" "She is crafty," the Fae replied with a grin, smoothing down his hair and brushing the leaves from his tunic. "Like a particularly irritating snake. You should have let her drown in the river." "Oh, this is fun." Jesse nodded, his gaze drifting to the lovely girl. "I think on that day often," he said softly. The two stared at each other a moment before he picked the satchel up off the ground and tossed it to the Fae. "And yes, you're probably right." "Should have let me drown, huh?" Without another word, Kiera yanked a sword from the shifter's belt and stormed out of the clearing, deliberately capsizing the tent as she left the camp behind and headed into the forest. "I no longer require your services, gentlemen. I'll be heading north on my own." She called out without bothering to glance behind her. If she had, their matching grins would have only made things worse. "Don't bother coming after me. I'm much happier without your company." She held the sword in both hands, hacking away at the trail. "I'll just be here, whistling." Chapter 7. It was much harder to hike up the mountains, having been beaten by a Fae for the bulk of the morning. It was harder still because Kiera insisted on leading the way, cutting a path for the others. This lasted a good 5 minutes, then she relented and fell back to her place in the middle. "A little winded?" the Fae teased, walking along beside her. She rubbed her upper arms with a rueful grin. "Just incredibly sore." He nodded wisely. "Just think if you'd gone with option 2. Jesse glanced over his shoulder, thinking randomly of using his mace. The three had been walking at a steep incline for the better part of the morning, and even those gifted with supernatural endurance were beginning to feel the strain. The journey had been relatively uneventful thus far, minus the skirmish at the tavern, but in a way that made them all the more cautious. One didn't travel so far in the wilderness without running into trouble. It felt like they were due. "So, we've been heading north for well over a week," Jesse called without warning, leaping from the underbrush to an even higher area of cleared ground. "How much longer before we reach your ancient friend?" The Fae leapt gracefully after him, while Kiera was a good deal more cautious, placing both hands securely on the rocks and staring down at the dizzying drop below. "He's not my friend," Eden corrected. "I told you before, I've never actually met him, and make no mistake, while I hope he'll be willing to help us, it's just as likely that he'll refuse outright and throw us straight back outside." Jesse glanced over his shoulder. "Then we'll force our way in again, right?" The Fae gave him a long look. "Sure, we'll force our way in." Tensions were running a bit higher than usual, but Kiera blamed the slope and the increasing elevation. For the last few hours they'd been winding their way higher and higher in the mountains, with less and less water to sustain them. They'd usually have stumbled upon some kind of pond or stream by now, but for whatever reason, the woods surrounding them were dry. "So I have a question." Jesse abandoned his place at the front and fell into step with the others, pacing thoughtfully along the edge of the bluff. "You said that your people were concerned with civilization. The owner of the tavern in Farian agreed." The Fae tensed ever so slightly, but kept his eyes straight on. "I don't hear a question. Where does that leave the rest of the realm?" Eden let out a weary sigh, staring into the trees with a dull expression, as if he'd been forced to have this conversation many times before. "Chances are it would be inaccessible to the rest of you. There are many amongst my kin who would leave this part of the world entirely, return to the way things were before." Kiera stared at his profile in shock. "Really?" "Really?" Jesse echoed in an entirely different tone. "Our people are starving, while yours are busy planning cities. Your illustrious immortal brethren don't happen to care about that." It wasn't exactly a fair accusation, especially considering that for countless centuries the fair folk had been holding the realm together with both hands. But it was not hard to see things from the shifter's perspective. He'd grown up in such a village. He'd seen such things for himself. "Many of them care," he answered softly. "Others wish to leave the rest of you to either flourish or perish." His face hardened with a quote. "Let the squabbling mortals destroy themselves." Jesse's eyes flashed heatedly, but Kiera spoke first. "You don't believe that," she said with certainty. The Fae cast her a quick look, looking abruptly tired. "Don't I?" "You're here," she insisted. "You decided to come with us." "Only to avoid something else," Jesse muttered. There was a pause in the Fae's stride, and for a split second he looked truly frightening. But when he spoke, his voice was as soft and collected as before. "Quicken your pace," he intoned, gesturing to Jesse in the front. "You're meant to be scouting ahead." It was certainly the wiser course of action, and in hindsight, the shifter was truly fortunate to have been granted such a gracious escape. But the floodgates had opened, and he missed all those obvious warnings, continuing his rash censure with one far-flung accusation after the next. The Fae are revered, idolized by everyone around them, yet they look upon the mortal creatures of the land with everything from indifference to open disdain. His eyes burned, and he shook his head slowly. "That is not strength. It is merely cementing your own impermanence." Eden let out a quiet sigh. "It is difficult when others make my argument for me." "Your whole philosophy makes no sense." Jesse ignored him, speaking with a passion and anger Kiera had never heard. "You immortals believe yourself to be so superior, yet she's right. You came along on this journey. You stepped between me and the others at the tavern." He circled in front of the Fae and came to a stop. "You would give your life for one of ours." "Because we are cursed with hope," Eden interrupted, finally losing what remained of his patience. He let out a breath, holding the shifter's gaze. "There is a chance you might get better." A ringing silence fell between them. When the shifter could think of nothing to say in reply, the Fae went on by himself, drawing a sword and hacking a rough path through the bushes, what Jesse should have been doing himself. Oh good, nettles. The three friends continued hiking into the later part of the afternoon, taking deliberate care not to stray anywhere deeper than casual conversation, and keeping even those light interactions as infrequent as possible. When, at last, it became clear that the mountain trail was not going to level off as they'd imagined, Kiera casually suggested they stop for lunch and began gathering wood for a fire. The men paused where they stood, turning around to watch her, then shot each other a swift look and doubled back to help. In the last few days, she'd stopped phrasing those suggestions as questions, and they were both feeling tired and hungry themselves. "I'm sorry," Jesse said quietly, casting a quick look at the Fae while he pulled the hatchet from his bag and started splitting the larger pieces of timber. "There may have been some truth in what I said, but you didn't deserve to hear it. You're quite different from the rest of your kind." "Not the best way to make amends?" Kiera glanced nervously between them as Eden returned his gaze. While the Fae might have a slightly more inclusive view than the rest of his people, it didn't mean he didn't also share their legendary pride. He was about to say something to this effect, but he turned instead and stared over the side of the bluff. A peculiar look shadowed across his face, and he slowly pushed to his feet. Jesse was already standing. By the time Kiera registered it, he'd caught her arm and pulled her up as well. "What is that?" Her eyes flashed between them, feeling abruptly and inconveniently mundane. "What?" she asked nervously. "What are you talking about?" But even as she asked the question, she felt the subtle shifting beneath her feet. It wasn't a vibration exactly, in that there wasn't a return pulse. It was as if the earth itself was slowly churning. Not the most convenient time to have been standing on the edge of a "Run!" By the time the Fae shouted, it was already too late. The ground slipped away like heated butter, spilling all three of them over the side of the bluff. Kiera let out a single scream, hands flying above her as the world vanished for a fleeting moment in a cloud of crimson hair. She had no way of knowing if the others had fallen beside her. She had no way of knowing if they were already splayed on the ground at the bottom of the cliff. But before that scream could echo into silence, a strong hand caught hold of her wrist. "Holy shit!" She jerked back to the present with a shriek of pain, feeling each of the delicate bones crack up the center as she swung with sudden violence into the side of the cliff. The world blinked in and out of focus as her vision exploded with stars. There was a sound of distant shouting, a vile curse that rang loud above the rest. Then her eyes cleared, and she lifted her head to see Jesse gripping the stones just a few feet above her, his face white with panic as the ledge crumbled quickly into dust. "Hold on!" They shouted this at the same time, eyes locked together as the crest of the mountain dissolved into a sea of debris. Sharp pieces of stone rained down on them, mixing into a blinding cloud of uprooted grass and dirt. Every time the shifter tried to get his footing, he would be struck anew, until the most that could be done was to hold tight and hope like hell their part of the mountain would still be standing when the landslide was finished. At this point, neither was convinced. "Can we jump?" she yelled, unsure whether he could hear her. Even with his advanced senses, it was impossible over the roar of the mountain, but he seemed to guess when his eyes locked on her lips. He shook his head wildly back and forth as his fingers tightened even harder, as if she might go rogue and try jumping for herself. "It's too far. We'd never make it." She looked around in horror. "But the mountain is falling apart." It wasn't the mountain, of course. It was just a few random pieces around the edges, right where the friends had been standing. So much so that it was hard not to take such a thing to heart. Like a distant dream, Eden's jest back in Farian floated through her ears. "You still believe in luck?" The earth gave another violent shudder, and the pair let out a collective scream. She was slipping in his grasp, Slowly, but surely. He was slipping off the mountain, even faster than she. It was only a matter of time before those rocks gave way for good, and she would see firsthand why the distance was too great for either of them to risk jumping down. Then something amazing happened. 2 became 3. Eden! The shifter let out a sudden cry as the Fae appeared behind him, startling in terror before realizing he'd been grabbed by a pair of strong hands. Where exactly he'd come from, neither of them would ever know. His clothes were torn, his satchel was missing, and there was a crescent-shaped tear running up the side of his neck. The only thing about him that looked remotely similar were his eyes. They were bright as ever, fixed with fierce determination on his new friends. There was a silent commotion above her. The Fae was shouting something directly into the shifter's ear, and whatever it was, Jesse clearly wasn't a fan. His eyes flashed down to Kiera before he abruptly shook his head, yelling something the girl would never be able to hear. The Fae merely gestured to the mountain, and the shifter let out a quiet sigh. Then, with a look of silent apology, he began shouting down instructions himself. "I'm going to swing you up!" She shook her head, unable to hear him. "I'm going to swing you up!" Eden tried miming it behind him, but that only added to the confusion. "I can't hear you!" She cupped her free hand over her ear. "It sounded like you said something crazy. It sounded like you said you were going to swing me." A rush of wind caught her scream, scattering it amongst the rubble, as her body became abruptly weightless, then rocketed through the air. The pain in her wrist was excruciating. For as wild and blinding the scene had become, she was somehow able to see her friends with perfect clarity as she soared in an arc above them, landing with an unlikely thud upon the grass. I'm going to kill." She spat out a mouthful of mud. "Am I alive?" She lifted her head precisely as the 2 men came flying up behind her, detaching from the rocks in a burst of speed, then dragging themselves with comical slowness over the side of the cliff. A part of her wanted to help them. A part of her wanted to push them back over the edge. Fortunately, such a decision was well beyond her control. "Kiera!" Jesse might have been a second away from blacking out, but he somehow managed to scramble across the grass and collapse on the ground at her side. A pair of surprisingly steady hands pushed back her hair so that he could get a clear look at her eyes. "Are you all right?" he gasped as the mountain gave way behind them. "I'm so sorry for throwing you like that. Eden was right. There wasn't any other..." He trailed off, staring at something just over her shoulder. For a second, she thought he was simply shell-shocked. There was no way both he and the Fae hadn't suffered the same compounded concussions she was battling herself, but there was something about his expression that made her twist around and follow his gaze. Big mistake. She turned towards the forest just as a strange creature stepped through the trees. Her mouth fell open, but there was no breath in her to scream. She understood now why the mountain had crumbled. It would have been impossible to remain intact under the weight of those immense feet. The only thing that remained a question was why that wolf pack hadn't ripped her apart in the forest. Why hadn't she died in the fire with the rest of her village? Why hadn't that terrible fever taken her like so many others when she was 12? Why would the fates have been so cruel and left her to this?